well, let's get going. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lindsay. This is on Twitter if you want to find me there. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia, which in my case is the Darkin young people, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded and treaty has never been signed. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Well, welcome to the August meetup. It's lovely to have you all here. We've been on a bit of a hiatus for the last 6 months. We were intending on returning to some in-person meetups, and then this little thing that you might have heard called Omicron came by. And I decided to pump the brakes on that. I've done the pumping of the brakes a couple of times now. And here we are rolling into August, doing another online meetup. So this is apparently the way that things are going to be for the rest of time now. I hope you all enjoy online meetups because that's the way that things are going to be, at least for the next little while. Before we continue, I just want to do a quick refresh of the code of conduct as well, which is that we don't tolerate harassment of meetup participants in any form. So we expect that all communication here is appropriate for a professional audience. And please remember that harassment and sexist, racist or exclusionary jokes are not appropriate for DevOps Sydney. The lovely thing about doing this thing online is that it is really easy to enforce that. I hope I don't have to do that, but if we do, those are the tools. All right, so tonight, as I said, welcome back after the 6-month hiatus. It's lovely to have you all here and to see such a strong turnout as well after being on such a long break. We look at the agenda. This is the intro that you are literally listening to right now. We've got an events and jobs section that we're going to do first, and then we're going to roll straight into the talk. Just as a bit of a prelude for that, jobs, if you're looking to fill a position, either because you are looking for work or you are hiring for somebody, there's going to be 30 seconds where you're going to be able to do that. So pop up the chat, pop a note in, just let me know ahead of time that that you have a position or yourself to spruik, and sort of form an orderly digital line. I'm just going to mute rule. There we go. All right, so tonight's talk, we've got Pradeep talking about securing your supply chain with software bills of materials. This is going to be super interesting. I've read plenty about SBOMs, but I would love to see some of this stuff in action. So buckle up. All right, before we launch into this, quick question. Who here is a first timer at the Sydney DevOps Meetup? Feel free to raise your hand either virtually or, hey, there we go. We've got a couple of hands that are popping up in the chat as well. It's lovely to have you all here. The great thing about doing this virtually is that we have folks coming from all over. Truth be told, neither myself nor Pradeep are actually in Sydney at the moment. I live up on the Central Coast and he's out of state. Normally I ask the question of like, what's the furthest people have come away from, but that doesn't really work. But you know, I'll do it anyway. Feel free to pop into the chat how far away you've come from. Oh, okay. We've already got, I wasn't looking at the chat and I've just switched over to it. I see that Josh has popped in from Joburg in South Africa, looking forward to, or planning to move to Sydney soon. Well, it'll be lovely to see you face to face when we do eventually return to in-person meetups. Bunch of folks from Sydney. Do we have anyone further than Joburg? Because that is, I think Josh might win for tonight. I mean, there's no prize, but you win the title for the evening. You know, feel free to pop it in there. All right. Well, it's lovely to have you all here, regardless of where you are dialing in from. Yeah, and as I mentioned, the online meetups, we're just going to continue indefinitely. I'm hoping that we can return to in-person meetups soon. But yeah, we'll just see how that goes. Right now, as we're sort of coming off the Omicron wave here, still feels a bit safer to do it by distance, but we'll see how that changes over time. All right, before we jump into the job section, which I mentioned, feel free to pop something in the chat if you're thinking about talking about a job or talking about yourself. A couple of events that are coming up really soon. So we've got the DevOps Talks conference that's going to be in Sydney. That's happening on September 6 and 7. The DevOps Talks folks do a great job of pulling in a whole bunch of international speakers. So if you've been missing out on DevOps conferences for the last 2 and a bit years, this is definitely one of the conferences that's worth checking out. They always have a really great lineup. We've also got API Days Australia, which is returning to an in-person conference the week after that. So that's on September 14 and 15 in Melbourne. If you're interested in speaking at that, their CFP is actually still open for another day or so. So time to get your applications in. Probably most interesting to the crowd here is SRECon for Asia Pacific. So this is the first time that SRECon APAC is actually being held in Australia. It's a really fantastic conference, some really interesting technical deep dives into all things SRE, both on the culture and on the technology side of things. If you are looking for a conference to go to this year, this would be it, is my advice. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on the papers committee. I'm saying it because it's going to be really fantastic. And I've been to SRECon a couple of times, and it's always a really fantastic turnout. So I definitely recommend you check that out. Finally, we've got YOW that's coming back as well. So YOW Sydney is happening on December 12 and 13. YOW's a pretty wide field of technology, both from front end to back end to infrastructure. Always really interesting speakers as well. So and they tend to get a lot of good international talent to come along and talk to that. So again, another sort of deeper technical conference that's definitely worth checking out. All right, that's it for events. Jobs, as I've mentioned a couple of times, we are going to do the job section. So if you are looking to fill a position either with yourself or with somebody else, you've got 30 seconds. So I've had somebody ping me, I've had Aaron ping me about a position at Macquarie, but Aaron, feel free to unmute yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Lindsay. My name's Aaron Weiscoves. I run an automation team at Macquarie. We've got network automation and a new network cloud team. So we're looking for a DevOps specialist, hopefully somebody that knows Terraform and is interested in learning more about networking and really getting into Amazon networking at scale.
Beautiful.
That's all.
And there is Aaron's very kindly sent me a link to the job. Aaron, I recommend that you post that on as a comment on this Meetup event, and people can find it afterwards. Brilliant. All right. Does anybody else have a position that they are looking to fill? If so, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to roll into the talk. Cool. I think that's it for now. All right. Well, let's just dive straight into it then. We've got Pradeep talking about securing your supply chain with software bills of, I've just had one person. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. There's one person that's just popped up there. So Josh as well, you're talking about it, looking for a job in Sydney. Josh, feel free to unmute yourself and spruik yourself for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Yeah, planning to relocate to Sydney later this year with my family, probably mid-October, November, somewhere around there. And we'll be looking for a senior engineer or lead engineer type position.
Excellent. Feel free to post a link through to your LinkedIn or personal site or resume or whatever you feel comfortable with, just as a comment on the Meetup event page. Brilliant. All right. I was too eager to get into Pradeep's talk. So I'm going to ask one last final time. Anybody else looking to either spruik themselves or spruik a position? I'm counting to 8 in my head because that's when people get uncomfortable and want to start speaking. All right. I think we're actually there now. Right. Let's do it. Pradeep, talking about securing a supply chain with SBOMs. Take it away.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll start sharing my screen. Yep. I'm very sure you can all see my screen. I'm not going to ask the same question.
Looking great.
Okay. Hey, everyone. My name is Pradeep Loganathan. I'm a platform architect at VMware. I'm reachable on Twitter at Pradeep L, and I blog at pradeepl.com. Today's conversation, it's a lightning talk, so I'll keep it short and sweet. It's primarily about securing a software supply chain. The software supply chain itself is a pretty large conversation, but talking about securing it is an even more larger conversation. So we'll be primarily talking about the provenance aspects of securing a supply chain, which is primarily around how do we generate SBOMs or software bill of materials, and how do you attest your SBOMs. when we take a look at the software supply chain, so initially, what exactly is a software supply chain? From a quick definition perspective, a software supply chain is all the components, libraries, tools, and processes that we use to develop, build, and publish software artifacts. A lot of these artifacts are produced generally by assembling open source and commercial software components developed in-house or by other vendors. A supply chain in itself has multiple vulnerabilities and attack vectors, which can impact the overall integrity of the supply chain. And supply chains are becoming very juicy targets now, primarily because there have been very large successful attacks previously, and the number of attacks are consistently increasing on the supply chain. Some of the various attack vectors which target a supply chain, specifically in terms of source integrity, are number one, developers can submit bad code, either inadvertently or sometimes maliciously, which results in the source code being impacted. Source control itself can be compromised, which again means that your source code is impacted. The code can be modified just before it reaches your build platform, which again means that your build packages get impacted. Your build platform itself can be compromised, which means your overall build is again impacted. The distribution repository can be compromised, which means that the packages that you generate out of your build are again impacted. The external package repository on which you depend and pull your dependencies from can itself be compromised, which again results in you in the software supply chain producing bad software artifacts, which can be malicious. So your software supply chain is a pretty large, juicy target for a lot of malicious attackers, and it needs to be secured. And in fact, the attacks on software supply chains have been consistently increasing and are becoming more and more sophisticated. If you look at the software artifacts that we generally produced, now all software is dependent on external and internal packages. There's a lot of dependencies that we generally are not even aware of when we build something. We do an npm install, or we do a NuGet install, and you pull in a lot of dependencies. And some of these dependencies are pulled in from online sources, which we are not even aware of as to what are the other transitive dependencies that those packages might have. So there's an increasing reliance on open source packages, and the ability to know what that particular software artifact depends on is becoming increasingly complex. Some of the well-known attacks, in the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of detail into those, are the Log4j attack. I'm very sure that most of us have been on calls, at least have been impacted by Log4j, both in terms of time and effort. That was a very successful supply chain attack, wherein there was an attack vector which was published, and that resulted in a lot of folks jumping onto it to sort of use that. Another one was the SolarWinds attack, which was much more sophisticated, wherein an update package for a particular network monitoring software called Orion, which was supplied by SolarWinds, was impacted, and that update package was deployed onto a variety of servers in government and non-governmental organizations, which resulted in a lot of exfiltration of data. That attack was sophisticated enough that the attackers had almost 14 months of dwell time to even stay in there and understand how systems were organized and exfiltrate data. So software supply chain attacks are becoming much more complex, and there are many ways in which to get into your network and sort of exfiltrate data. So with all of these things happening, how is the open source community reacting to this? So one of the ways in which the open source community has been trying to sort of get ahead of this is using coming up with frameworks and processes to sort of prevent it. One of the frameworks is called SALSA, which stands for Supply Chain Levels for Software Artifacts. This is an end-to-end framework for ensuring the integrity of software artifacts which are produced through the software supply chain. It is also a supply chain security capability model. It's maintained by the Open Source Security Foundation, or OpenSSF, and it's got large contributions from VMware, Intel, Datadog, and many others. SALSA primarily defines 4 categories of defensive measures around source, build, provenance, and common. Again, in this talk, we're primarily going to focus on the provenance aspects of the supply chain. So when we talk about provenance, SALSA recommends that the provenance should be available. Provenance of a software artifact should be authenticated. The provenance should be non-falsifiable, and provenance should ideally be service generated. So we talk about provenance being automatically generated, being available for every software artifact, and provenance being authenticated and it should not be falsifiable. So since we're talking a lot about provenance, what exactly does provenance mean? When we look at provenance, the Oxford definition is out there. But for me, provenance generally reminds me of the fact that wine has provenance, fine art has provenance. It basically means that there is a history to it. We know what's an authenticated source for it. We know that there is a certain ownership to it, and there's an authenticity to it. And that's what you're trying to get in terms of what we're trying to do with our software artifacts too. We're trying to say, hey, I mean, this software artifact has a sense of ownership, it has some authenticity, and there is a history associated with it, which can be authenticated and which cannot be falsified. And one of the ways of ensuring that there is authenticity and that there is provenance for a software artifact is by using what's called a software bill of materials, or SBOM. A software bill of materials is basically something that says it's more like the ingredients list that you would have when you go out to a store to buy, let's assume, pasta sauce, and you can see on the bottle and figure out, okay, what's within this bottle, and you can figure out what is it made up of, right? So a software bill of material basically says, what does a software artifact contain? It provides a comprehensive listing of all its package dependencies, the files, licenses, and all other assets that together make up that particular software artifact. So what does an SBOM actually contain? So within an SBOM, it actually lists all software components of that particular artifact. It lists the various versions of those software components. It lists dependencies of those software components. It also lists not just the primary dependencies, but also the transitive dependencies. So for example, there might be a dependency which might depend on second order, third order software components, which are also listed. It also lists licensing information. Now, this is again pretty critical because licensing, people who understand differences between GPL licensing, GNU licensing, it's extremely important to be aware of these licensing artifacts. And it also lists OS packages. For example, in case of containers, it also lists things like what are the base OS packages for those containers. Now, how do you generate SBOMs, and what are the artifacts for which SBOMs can be generated? SBOMs can be generated from source code. So basically, you can point SBOM generator at a folder containing source code, and it can generate a software bill of materials based on source code that exists in that particular folder. SBOMs can be generated from application builds. So you can point it towards your final application package, and it can generate an SBOM from it. SBOMs can be generated from container images. So a container image has various layers. So the SBOM can look at each of these layers. It can sort of run through these layers and produce information about what each of these layers contain. SBOMs can also be generated from running containers. Now, this is also very important because when a container is running, the layers of the container can be updated. Sometimes I've seen containers update packages also. So it's very critical to be able to generate SBOMs from running containers. Now, what are SBOMs used for? SBOMs give us a list of what is contained within that particular software artifact. So it's used primarily for security assessments. It is used for compliance review. It is used for ensure that we are compliant in terms of licensing, and it's also used for integrity verification. There are much more complex use cases for SBOMs coming out right now. SBOMs are also being used for SBOM drift detection across the whole supply chain, and the whole area is becoming a lot more sophisticated. But primarily, SBOMs are used for security assessments, compliance reviews, both as well as license compliance reviews and integrity verification. SBOMs can be generated with various specifications. There are primarily two specifications. One is SPDX and the other one is CycloneDX. So SPDX stands for Software Data Package Data Exchange. The initial draft was in 2010. It comes out from the SPD working group of the Linux Foundation, and you can generate SPDX specification using various formats such as RDF, SPDX, YAML, or JSON. The other format is CycloneDX. The initial draft was in 2017, and you can output it as an XML or a JSON. There is also the SWID or software ID, which is another specification. It's a bit of a dated specification, and I haven't seen a lot of SBOMs being generated with this specification, but it comes from the ISO IEC technical committee, and you can generate SWID specification in XML or CBOR formats. So now we talked about what's SBOM, what are the various, what do we use it for, and what are the various formats. So who generates SBOMs? So there are a bunch of software components that you can use to generate SBOMs. Sift is a leading contender from Ancho. Then there is Turn, and right now you can also generate SBOMs out of Kubernetes, Docker, and even Microsoft is out there with an SBOM generator. So SBOM generators, most of these are open sourced, and you can use this within your supply chain to generate software bill of materials. Now we have looked at generating SBOMs. We have looked at why SBOMs are important. Now, the next aspect is that as we start to generate SBOMs, another vulnerability that's come out is that SBOMs itself can come under attack and SBOMs can be modified. So the next part of this is to be able to attest your SBOM. So right now there is a concept of attesting your SBOM. So when we talk about attestation, what are we talking about? So when we generate an SBOM for a container image, let's assume, an attestation ensures that the SBOM that you generated for that particular container image is accurate and it can be signed and sealed so that any modification to that particular SBOM can be detected. So it basically says that the SBOM that I generated for container with a SHA-ID of X has not been modified, has not been tampered with, and is an accurate representation of what is contained within that container image when it was generated. Again, there are various formats, various software out there which generates, which help with attestation, but primarily the Cosign is one of the largest programs out there which are working in this field of attestation. So basically, in this case, you can use Cosign to ensure that the signer can attest that the SBOM is an accurate representation of the contents of the container image. Consumers can, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, cool. So you can use Cosign to generate attestation for your SBOM that you have generated. Consumers can then decide whether to trust a signer or not. Consumers can detect if if the data that they're ingesting has been tampered with, since that particular attestation has been created. So how do you generally attest an SBOM? SBOMs can be attested using the primary key cryptography interface. So you basically generate a public key and a private key, and you sign the SBOM that's been generated, or you rather attest it using your private key, and it can be verified using your public key. Again, there is a lot of work being done in this particular area, similar to Let's Encrypt, which sort of ensure that folks use HTTPS and TLS on the websites. FullCO is a project which provides root CA for code signing. So this is similar to Let's Encrypt, wherein it provides root certificates to sign SBOMs. And FullCO also publishes these certificates to unique certificate transparency log. Another project that's noteworthy is Record. Record provides immutable tamper-resistant ledger of metadata generated in the supply chain. So basically the SBOM that you generate and you sign is maintained in this registry, and it's tamper-proof, and it maintains history, and you basically sign the metadata to the immutable record. So what we have right now is we've generated SBOMs, which basically tell you what's within a software package. You also then attested it to make sure that it cannot be tampered with. Now, how would you use it in your operations? From an operations perspective, if folks have been using something like a Gatekeeper, which is a policy manager for Kubernetes, Gatekeeper provides a Cosign provider. So basically what it does is to check if any image that your cluster pulls in has been signed and has been attested, and an SBOM has been generated, and it allows that particular image to be pulled into your cluster and executed only if this has been satisfied as per its policy. So you can set up a policy which says only signed attested images would be allowed to run within the cluster and nothing else would be allowed to run. And Gatekeeper would ensure that that policy would be implemented. So this gives you the guarantee that what you run in your cluster contains an SBOM. You know what it contains, and you know that it's not been tampered with, and it's pretty safe to run within your cluster. So this is primarily a really quick conversation about software bill of materials, what you would use it for, and how would you use it. This space is still evolving very rapidly. For example, some of the components that I talked about here, FullCO Record, are not even 1.0, they're still lower than 1.0s. So they're still being worked on, but there is a lot of progress in this area, and there's an exciting area to be in. So yep, that's my quick lightning talk on securing a software supply chain using SBOMs. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pradeep. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out, or otherwise feel free to unmute and ask away. I actually have a question. So I'm not going to hold too much of the limelight, but I was curious on your opinion of how some of the SBOM tools that you were talking about just now fit in a world with things like SigStore for like artifact signing and software supply chain verification. Like, how do you see the two worlds coexisting? Or even not?
Cosign is from SigStore. SigStore is what's been primarily driving a lot of these things. And what's happening is SigStore is also coordinating across full CO record and a bunch of these other programs. So Cosign is from SigStore. You basically use Cosign to sign and record in full CO from attestation perspective. So there is a lot of, I would say, momentum behind these, and they're moving forward. And I can see there's also commercial products coming out there, which incorporate these to ensure that container images being generated through the supply chain are signed and attested.
Yeah, that's great. I guess the other thing that's probably worth noting in the broader picture is that the US government is making moves to stop the purchase of software that isn't able to provide an SBOM, which is pretty huge.
Yeah, there is a presidential decree which says that even today there was a news that the Department of Defense would not procure any software which does not have a signed and attested SBOM against it. So there is a lot more momentum going behind this.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Any other questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll read them out or unmute. Otherwise,
since it's a lightning talk, I'm not going through the demo, but maybe at a later point in time, I could do a full demo of all the tools that I ran through over here.
That would be really, really interesting. I would love that. That actually goes really nicely to this next and last slide that I have, which is we need more speakers. So, Pradeep, thank you for volunteering. Maybe not for September, just give you a little bit of a rest, but
Sure.
later this year. We've got Halvard talking about building containerized Go apps with Scaffold and Co. And that's lined up for September. Again, it'll be another online meetup. So that Halvard's a really engaging speaker. It'll be a really interesting topic. So I highly recommend coming along to that. But as I mentioned, we're definitely looking for speakers. So if you're interested in giving a lightning talk or a full length talk, we would absolutely love to have you. All right, that's it. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks, Pradeep, for giving a fantastic talk. Lovely to have you all back as we're resuming the meetup, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pradeep. Thanks, Lindsay.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Guys.